When Clint Eastwood walked into a small-town elementary school, nobody expected the legendary actor and director to be there. To the students, he was just another visitor, until he walked into a fifth-grade classroom and left everyone speechless. Because that day, a group of bullies made the biggest mistake of their lives, humiliating a kid who had already fought tougher battles than anyone in the room. What they didn't know was that Clint wasn't just there to shake hands. He was there to teach a lesson. And in true Clint Eastwood style, he did it in a way that no one would ever forget. It was a typical school morning, but for Jake Carter, every day felt like a battle. He sat hunched over his desk, his fingers gripping the edges of his math book, eyes locked on the numbers that blurred together in front of him. The classroom buzzed softly around him, pencils scratching against paper, whispers slipping between desks, the occasional stifled laugh from the back row. But Jake had mastered the art of tuning it all out. He adjusted the worn-out baseball cap on his head, pulling it lower, letting the brim cast a shadow over his eyes. The hat was his shield, his armor. Without it, he felt exposed, vulnerable. He had lost his hair weeks ago, another casualty in his battle against leukemia. First, it had fallen out in strands, then clumps. Until one morning, he woke up and saw his pillow covered in what was left. That was the day he decided the hat would never come off. At home, his mom told him he was strong. His dad called him a warrior. But at school, some kids saw something different: weakness, a target. Jake tried not to care. He focused on the things that made him happy, the little things that let him escape the reality of hospital beds and IV drips. Westerns. Every night, curled under his blanket, he watched Clint Eastwood movies on repeat. He memorized the lines, studied the way Clint carried himself, silent, steady, fearless. He didn't just act tough, he was tough. Jake wanted to be like that. But Clint Eastwood never had to sit in a classroom where kids whispered behind his back. He never had to pretend he didn't hear the quiet snickers when someone muttered "Baldy" under their breath. Mrs. Parker, his teacher, was one of the good ones. She always made sure no one messed with him. But teachers couldn't hear everything. From the back row, a hushed voice drifted through the air. "Bet he sleeps with that stupid hat on." A few chuckles followed. Jake gritted his teeth. He stared down at his desk, focusing on the numbers, the letters, anything but the burning in his chest. He wasn't going to let them win. But today, something was different. Today, the bullies weren't just whispering. Today, they were going to take things further. And Jake wouldn't see it coming. The cafeteria was loud, filled with the clatter of trays and the hum of 100 conversations happening at once. Jake sat at the far end of a table, picking at his sandwich, his baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He had gotten good at blending in, making himself invisible. But Ryan never let him stay invisible for long. "Hey, hat boy." Ryan's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Jake's grip tightened on his sandwich, his stomach knotting. Just ignore them. That was the rule. If he didn't react, they'd get bored. Move on. But Ryan didn't do bored. He plopped down across from Jake, his usual pack of troublemakers flanking him. "Why do you always wear that dumb hat?" Ryan asked, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads. "You hiding something?" Jake didn't answer. Ryan smirked, then lunged forward fast as a snake. Before Jake could react, Ryan's hand snatched the cap off his head. The cafeteria went silent. Jake's breath caught. He felt it, the cold air on his bare scalp, the weight of 100 eyes on him. He reached up instinctively, but it was too late. For the first time in months, he was exposed. A slow grin spread across Ryan's face. "Oh man," he laughed, holding the cap up like a trophy. "Look at that cue ball." Laughter erupted, not from everyone, but enough. Jake's face burned, his hands clenched into fists under the table. He wouldn't cry. Cowboys don't cry. Mia, the only person who ever stood up for him, gasped from a few seats down. "Ryan, stop it!" Ryan twirled the cap on his finger like he was some kind of cowboy himself. "Relax," he said, shrugging. "I was just curious." Jake stared at his hat in Ryan's hand. He wanted to grab it, wanted to tell Ryan to give it back, but Ryan wasn't done. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the hat across the cafeteria. Jake's stomach dropped. He watched as it landed a few tables away, right in front of a group of older kids who looked down at it in surprise. The laughter grew louder. Jake pushed his chair back and stood, his legs weak beneath him. He was already exhausted. Chemo had drained every ounce of strength from his body, but now he had no choice. He had to walk across the cafeteria and pick up his hat. He could already hear the whispers, the chuckles. Each step felt heavier than the last, and as he bent down to grab the cap, he knew this was the worst moment of his life. But what Jake didn't know, what no one in that cafeteria knew, was that the next day everything would change. Because someone was coming, and when they walked through that school's doors, Ryan wouldn't be laughing anymore. The silence in the cafeteria was suffocating. The laughter had faded, but the damage was done. Jake clutched his baseball cap in his hands, his fingers twisting the fabric, willing himself to disappear. His stomach churned. Cowboys didn't cry. Then, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Ryan Thompson." The entire cafeteria froze. Mrs. Parker strode forward, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. She wasn't the kind of teacher who raised her voice, but when she did, everyone listened. Ryan shrugged casually, leaning back in his seat like he had done nothing wrong. "What?" he drawled. Mrs. Parker's eyes were cold. "Steel." "You know exactly what," she said. "We do not humiliate people in this school." Jake swallowed hard, keeping his gaze on the floor. "Please don't make this worse." Ryan exchanged glances with his friends, smirking. He wasn't afraid. Not of Mrs. Parker, not of anyone. "Relax," he said, stretching his arms. "I was just messing around." Mrs. Parker's jaw tightened. "You call stealing someone's hat and mocking them in front of the entire cafeteria messing around?" Ryan rolled his eyes. If he's so weak, maybe he shouldn't be in school. A few gasps. Someone whispered, "Whoa." Jake felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. Then, Mia stood up. "That's not funny," she snapped. Mia never raised her voice, but now she was glaring at Ryan like she wanted to throw her lunch tray at his head. "You think it's cool to pick on someone who's already going through enough?" Ryan's smirk faltered, but only for a second. "Geez, chill out," he muttered. Mrs. Parker's expression hardened. "Ryan, you will apologize, right now, or you'll be spending the next 2 weeks in detention." Ryan huffed dramatically, like this was all a giant inconvenience. He turned to Jake and mumbled, "Sorry?" "It wasn't real. It wasn't anything." Jake nodded stiffly, swallowing the lump in his throat. He knew this wasn't over. Ryan wouldn't let it be over. Mrs. Parker exhaled, looking at Jake with something like gentle understanding. "You okay, Jake?" He nodded again. "Lieutenant." She hesitated before turning to Ryan and his friends. "Back to your seats, now." The cafeteria slowly returned to normal, conversations restarting, the tension dissolving into whispers. But Jake still felt hollow. Because no matter what Mrs. Parker said, no matter how many times Ryan was told off, the damage was already done. And deep down, Jake wasn't sure he'd ever shake this feeling. The car ride was quiet. Jake stared out the window, watching the world blur past. Houses, trees, kids riding their bikes. Normal life, rolling on like nothing had happened. His baseball cap was back on his head, but it didn't feel the same. Sarah Carter glanced at her son from the driver's seat. His shoulders were slumped, his hands curled into fists in his lap. He had been quiet ever since she picked him up. She didn't need to ask. She already knew. "Rough day," she said softly. Jake inhaled sharply, held it, exhaled, held it again. For a second he thought he could keep it in. But then the tears came. He clenched his jaw, turning his face away, furious at himself for letting them spill. But no matter how hard he fought it, his small frame shook with the weight of it all. Sarah's heart shattered. She pulled into their driveway but didn't turn the engine off. Instead, she reached over, resting a hand on Jake's knee. "Hey," she murmured. "It's okay." Jake sniffled, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "I hate this," he whispered. "I hate being the weak one." "You're not weak, Jake." He shook his head, didn't believe her. "I just wish—" His voice cracked. "I wish I could be strong, like Clint Eastwood." Sarah swallowed hard. She should have seen this coming. Every night when the world felt too heavy, Jake escaped into those old westerns, into a world where the strong stood tall, the good guys won, and no one laughed at the cowboy in the hat. She stared at him, her little boy, her fighter, her cowboy. And right then, she made a decision. She wouldn't let her son believe he was weak, not when she knew the truth, not when the world was about to see it, too. The house was quiet that night. Jake had finally fallen asleep, his small frame curled up under his worn-out Clint Eastwood blanket, the one his dad had bought him last Christmas. His baseball cap lay on the nightstand beside him, neatly placed, as if putting it down in the right spot could somehow make the day feel less awful. Sarah stood in the doorway watching him. Her heart ached. She had seen Jake cry before. Hospital nights, bad chemo days, moments when the pain was too much to bear. But this was different. This wasn't about the illness. This was about the world being cruel when it didn't have to be. She exhaled, walking into the kitchen, her mind made up. She sat down at the table, pulled a blank sheet of paper from the drawer, and picked up a pen. For a moment, she just stared at the empty page. What was she even doing? Writing to a Hollywood legend? A man who had probably never read a fan letter in his life? It was ridiculous. But she thought of Jake, of the way his voice cracked when he said he wished he could be strong like Clint Eastwood. And suddenly, the words came. "Dear Mr. Eastwood, my son Jake is 10 years old, and he thinks you're the greatest cowboy to ever walk the earth. He watches your movies when he's too sick to go outside. He memorizes your lines, studies the way you stand, how you don't flinch, how you don't back down. He tells me that cowboys don't cry. But today, he did." Sarah blinked back tears as she continued, describing what had happened at school, how Ryan had humiliated him, how Jake had stood there, frozen, too tired to fight back. "I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect anything at all. I just wanted someone to know that my son, this incredible, brave boy, is out there, trying his best in a world that sometimes feels like it's against him." She hesitated, then added one last line. "If there's anything I've learned from your movies, Mr. Eastwood, it's that sometimes a kid just needs to believe in something bigger than himself. And right now, Jake needs a reason to believe." She signed it, folded it carefully, and slipped it into an envelope. She didn't tell Jake. She didn't even tell her husband. Because what were the odds? Sarah Carter had no way of knowing that her letter was about to land in the hands of a legend, and that Clint Eastwood was about to change everything. A week passed, life moved on as much as it ever did. Jake went to school, keeping his head down, avoiding Ryan's gaze. His baseball cap stayed firmly in place. The letter? Sarah tried to forget about it. She figured it had ended up in some fan mail black hole, unopened, unread, just another mother's desperate attempt to make the world a little kinder for her son. Then, the phone rang. It was early evening, the sun just starting to set. Sarah was folding laundry in the living room, half listening to Jake's movie playing in the background. The number on the caller ID was unfamiliar. She sighed, assuming it was another robocall, another urgent message about her car's extended warranty. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello?" A pause, then a voice. A deep, unmistakable, gravelly voice. "Mrs. Carter?" Sarah froze. This is Clint Eastwood." Her breath caught in her throat. She gripped the phone tighter as if it might slip right through her fingers. She blinked rapidly, her mind scrambling to process what was happening. "I'm sorry. Did you say—" "Clint Eastwood," he repeated, calm as ever. Like this was just another phone call, another Tuesday. Sarah pressed a hand to her chest. "I got your letter," Clint continued, "and I gotta tell you, your boy sounds like one tough kid." Tears pricked at her eyes. She couldn't believe this was real. "He is," she whispered. There was a pause on the other end. Then Clint sighed, the kind of sigh that carried understanding, regret, something deeper. "I've met a lot of tough guys," he said finally, "but this kid sounds like the real deal." Sarah let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her eyes. "I want to do something for him," Clint continued. "I don't want him thinking he's alone in this fight." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "Mr. Eastwood, you don't have to—" "I want to," Clint interrupted. His voice left no room for argument. And then, in that legendary Clint Eastwood way, he said something that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Tell me where he goes to school," he said. "I've got an idea." Sarah nearly dropped the phone, because this wasn't just a response, this was a plan. And tomorrow, when Jake walked into school, he would have no idea that a cowboy was coming for him. And that when Clint Eastwood walked through those doors, Ryan wouldn't be laughing anymore. Jake trudged through the school hallway, his baseball cap pulled low, his backpack feeling heavier than usual. The whispers had never really stopped since the cafeteria incident. They followed him everywhere now. He could feel them, kids nudging their friends, murmuring under their breath, sneaking glances at the boy with the hat, the boy who got humiliated. Jake kept walking. Mrs. Parker greeted him at the door with a small, knowing smile. "Morning, Jake?" "Morning," he mumbled, sliding into his seat as fast as possible. From across the room, Ryan smirked. Look who decided to show up. Jake ignored him. Ryan leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting. "Still hiding under that hat, huh?" Before Jake could even process a comeback, the classroom door swung open, hard. The sound echoed, snapping every head toward the entrance, and then the room fell silent. A tall figure stepped inside, slow and deliberate. Leather jacket, rugged boots, piercing blue eyes that could freeze a man in his tracks. Jake's breath hitched. Mrs. Parker blinked in disbelief. "Oh my God!" Ryan, for the first time in his entire life, had nothing to say, because standing in the doorway, staring down the room like he was about to deliver the final showdown of an old Western, was none other than Clint, freaking Eastwood. A hushed wave of murmurs rippled through the class. A girl gasped. Someone else whispered, "No way." But Clint? He didn't speak. He just stood there, his gaze sweeping the room, slow, measured, assessing. The kind of look that could make grown men nervous. And sure enough, Ryan shifted uncomfortably, because Clint Eastwood wasn't just a celebrity, he was a legend. And right now he was staring directly at him. The room was dead silent. Jake could barely hear his own breathing. His hands tightened into fists under his desk, his heart pounding so hard he thought the whole class might hear it. Clint took a slow step forward. His boots thudded against the linoleum floor, the kind of sound that belonged in a saloon, not a fifth-grade classroom. He stopped beside Jake's desk, and then, in that deep, gravelly voice, he said, "So, you're the little cowboy I've been hearing about?" Jake swore the entire world stopped. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Clint tilted his head, his sharp gaze softening just slightly. "Your mama tells me you like Westerns." Jake finally managed a small, stunned nod. Clint reached into his jacket pocket. The class watched in complete shock and awe as he pulled out something black and perfectly shaped, smooth and worn from years of history. A Stetson cowboy hat. He turned it over in his hands, then placed it gently in front of Jake. "Every real cowboy needs a hat," he said. Jake stared. No way. His fingers trembled as he reached for it, lifting the Stetson like it was the most sacred artifact in the world. It wasn't just a hat. It was a symbol, a gift, a message. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood." Clint gave him a small nod. "Wear it proud, kid." Jake grinned as he pulled the Stetson onto his head, for the first time in weeks feeling like himself again. The class was still frozen in disbelief. Then, Clint turned, and his gaze locked onto Ryan. Ryan, who had spent months laughing, mocking, tearing people down. Ryan, who suddenly looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk and disappear. Clint took a step toward him. His voice was calm, too calm. "Back in my day, we had a word for fellas who picked on the weak." Ryan swallowed, hard. Clint's eyes narrowed. "We called them cowards." Ryan turned pale. The classroom was dead silent. Ryan wouldn't meet Clint's eyes. His usual cocky smirk was gone, his fingers tapping anxiously on his desk. He had no comeback, no smart remark. "Because what do you say when Clint Eastwood just called you a coward?" Clint didn't move for a long moment. He just stared Ryan down, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. The whole class was holding its breath. Then, without a word, Clint pulled up a chair. The old wooden legs scraped against the floor, the sound sharp in the stillness. He sat down, not as a Hollywood star, not as a legend, but as a man who had something to say. "Now listen up," Clint began, his voice low and steady, the kind that commanded attention. "You kids might think strength is about being the loudest in the room, about pushing people around, making them feel small." Ryan shifted in his seat. Clint leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But let me tell you something," he continued. "That ain't strength. That's weakness, dressed up as power." His gaze swept across the room, landing on each student, making sure they were listening. And they were. "A cowboy ain't the one who knocks people down," he said. "He's the one who lifts them up." The words hung in the air. Jake felt something shift inside him. For so long, he had felt like the weakest kid in the room, like no matter what he did, he would always be the sick one, the target. But now, Clint Eastwood was telling him otherwise. Jake lifted his head high. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like hiding. He squared his shoulders, sat up straighter. Clint turned to him and patted his shoulder. "You kid, you're the toughest guy in this room." Jake felt the warmth of those words settle deep in his chest. Ryan's eyes flickered toward him, something like regret creeping into his expression. He swallowed hard, his usual bravado completely gone. For the first time, Ryan looked ashamed. And for the first time, Jake didn't feel small. The bell rang, but no one moved. No one whispered. No one laughed. They just sat there, still processing the fact that Clint Eastwood had just given them a life lesson they would never forget. But Clint? He just stood up. "All right, partner," he said, turning back to Jake. "Let's get you outside." Jake grinned, adjusting his brand new Stetson on his head. "Yes, sir." As Clint led Jake toward the door, the entire class watched them go, wide-eyed, silent, in absolute awe. This was a story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. When they stepped into the hallway, the news had already spread like wildfire. By the time they reached the front entrance, students were peeking out of classrooms, whispering, nudging their friends. "That's Clint Eastwood." Did he seriously just call Ryan a coward? Jake got a hat from Clint freaking Eastwood. Jake kept walking, his chin up, his back straight. For the first time since his diagnosis, he didn't feel like just the sick kid. He felt like the cowboy. Outside, Sarah was waiting. The second she saw Jake standing taller than she'd seen in months, she pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes shining. Clint gave her a small nod. "Told you he was the real deal." Sarah let out a shaky laugh. "You really didn't have to do this." Clint raised an eyebrow. "Yeah," he said. "I did." Before anyone could say anything else, Footsteps shuffled behind them. Jake turned. Ryan was standing there, awkward, shifting from foot to foot. His usual confidence was gone. "Hey, Ryan scratched the back of his neck, avoiding eye contact. "I was kinda a jerk. Sorry, man." Jake blinked. Ryan? Apologizing? He studied Ryan for a moment, then tipped his new cowboy hat and offered a small smile. "No hard feelings," he said. Ryan nodded, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Cool." Clint smirked. "Guess there's hope for you yet, kid." Ryan flushed. Then, with that same slow, deliberate stride, Clint turned toward his car, a classic, dusty old pickup that looked like it had seen 100 desert roads. Jake watched him go, his heart still racing, still buzzing from everything that had just happened. Clint opened the driver's side door but paused, looking over his shoulder one last time. His eyes met Jake's. "Keep your head up, kid," he said. "Real cowboys don't back down." Jake grinned. And then, with a final tip of his hat, Clint Eastwood climbed into his truck, turned the key, and pulled onto the road. As the sun dipped low in the sky, he drove off into the distance, just like a cowboy was always meant to. And at that moment, Jake knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of his story. This was just the beginning. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more insane.